All right, good evening. It's good to have all of you back again. Hope you had a productive day, midweek, Wednesday, as we get into the month of May. We thank God for the progress that we are making, that we continue to make, and the opportunities that He's giving all of us. We hope we continue to observe the regulations that have been stipulated concerning the coronavirus. Okay. Today's class picks up from where we left. I will hope to summarize it as we try to tackle issues of conflict and issues of violence, issues of power, and the relations of power. We did yesterday seek to bring an understanding to the concepts of power and how power relations affect human behavior and affect political systems. Today, our class will try and delve into the international relations aspect of things. Okay, I'm aware we are all a bit familiar, at least on the basic level, with the local concept of power relations. Eventually, I will get to speak about them more national-centered wise when we look at issues such as elections and the contestation of power by politicians. So that will come up and I will interact with those concepts. In order for me to have a proper feel of explaining the power contestations that take place within a country, such as elections and other such, as well as in order for me to properly have a feel of the various power contestations that take place between states, it's imperative for me to have an umbrella type of approach whereby we will interact with breaking down and comparing interstate with intrastate modes of conflict. We will try and progress through, starting with the predictions that were made by several writers and authors, the preparedness of the international system with dealing with conflicts of an international nature that were predominantly within the state and not between states, the motivations behind it, as well as the adaptations that we have developed with modern day conflict. And we'll have several case studies that will try and understand how have we lagged behind, for instance, as the African continent, and also the progresses that we have made, and hopefully the efforts that we have made towards silencing the guns, as the African Union has projected to do. So we'll introduce this topic generally. We'll look at the evolution of war, the evolution of conflict. We'll look at, you must understand that when we use the phrases war, conflict, other such words, you see, war, conflicts, violence, typically I am meaning the same thing. I understand that when you break them down, they differ. I know war may be more of between, organized military powers, and conflict can exist generally even between you and I, and violence is when generally believed to be a much more extended form of conflict. Okay, but I will try to, which involves physical, of course, which involves physical force, but I'll try to interchange them. I'll use them interchangeably. So when you hear me say war, I mean conflict. When you hear me say violence, I mean war. When you hear me say conflict, I mean both violence and war. Okay, so I'm meaning the same thing. So let's get right into it, because we want to try and have a very quick class today. So the Uppsala Conflict Data Program from the Uppsala University says that the number of ongoing conflicts has declined since shortly after the end of the Cold War, and the severity of armed conflict has generally declined since World War II. Okay, so this is from the Global Trends in Armed Conflict report. It observes that the number of conflicts has declined worldwide, and since World War II, the severity of these conflicts has also declined. Okay, generally, and this is an overall type of perspective. I realize some countries in Africa would not agree with such an assumption, but it is an average approach. So after a period of steady decline in the number of armed conflicts in the world, the downward trend has ended. The number of active conflicts is no longer sinking, but has held steady at 32 for 3 years in a row. This data was collected about 2 years ago. So they were, about 2 years ago, 32 conflicts that were active for a consistent period of about 3 years. Okay? We now live in the longest period since World War II without interstate war. These are wars that are fought between two or more countries. We register no new conflicts of any type over the previous 2 years. This is the first time in the post-war period in which 2 years have passed with no new conflicts having broken out. This statement was made in 2002. And I think it is largely true up to now that there's hardly any conflict between states, violent conflict, war between states. We have conflict between states. Recently, the presidents of Angola and Congo were called on to try and mediate a situation between Rwanda and Uganda that led to the closure of the border even. So you can see that conflict does exist, okay, between states, but violent conflict and war has generally reduced. Okay, so since 1900, far more people have been killed by their own governments than by foreign armies. This was included in the partnership report done by the Human Security Project, as well as the Simon Fraser University in Canada. It observed that, as a matter of fact, more people have died at the hands of their own government than through foreign armies. Okay, so that is something we have to take into consideration as we go into this debate of interstate and intrastate. So during Cold War, ethnicity or nationalism were outdated concepts and largely resolved problems. Okay, since the early 1990s, a drastic decrease in number of armed conflicts in the world has been observed, and the end of the Cold War, being around 1990, showed many positive signs of a more peaceful world. There are many theories that exist, and we will look at the main theories. If you want to read ahead as we go, you can jot down. The democratic peace theory is a good theory to understand, even as we get into this study. There's a theory known as democratic peace. It's a very important theory to understand. Also, the nuclear proliferation theory, also, that is one you can bag. Just bag it in the side, we'll just dive into it. Okay, so the overall trend has been observed as being positive, and the number of armed conflicts has indeed decreased. So between 2003 and 2008, the number of active conflicts involving state actors rose from 29 to 37. That is about 30-40% increase. And interstate conflicts re-emerged in shape of US-led unilateralism. This is what we now know as the fight against terrorism and the forceful implementation of democracy. So the example of the situation in Libya and other countries where democracy has been imposed on those people and on those states, and this has led to a certain existence of conflict between states, but which is led by a unilateral approach by the United States. When you do study international relations, the phrase unilateralism comes up, especially when dealing with hegemonies such as the United States, and it becomes a very important theory to understand. So 2009 and 2010, there was a decrease in active conflicts, followed in the first half of 2011 by the Arab Spring and new related conflicts. The Arab Spring is another incident that brings a complete dimension of change to our understanding of conflict. Here we are dealing with a situation where just in the early days of the end of the Cold War, we have conflict between states, and soon after that we have violence of ethnicity and nationalism and things like that. And the Arab Spring just comes and changes the tides by bringing up revolution, and revolution, mass-led revolution by the people, movements that are bred from within society against the regime. And this goes on from one country to another, toppling leaders that have existed and regimes that have existed for so many years. I can assure you the international community up to now has still not formulated a proper strategy and approach to deal with a setup like that of the Arab Spring. It continues to be a topic of discussion. So the most common form of violent conflicts today is intrastate conflicts. This is within the states. It is usually connected to the formation of states or civil wars. So in Africa, we have experienced a fair share of this, secession attempts, coup attempts, and things like that. Civil wars, movements towards achievement of socio-economic equality have led to violence and conflict, as well as war, civil war in many cases. So many spring from power struggles. These are the demand for rights, the demand for economic advantage, natural resources and cultural identity, as we have already discussed these issues. If you've not been a part of these classes, I advise you visit my page. I've listed all the classes are there. You can see them, and we have already discussed the sources of conflict, for instance, and the impact that they have each had on the social dynamics and the socio-economic progression of society, as well as the efforts and aspirations towards development. Okay, so these new wars last for long periods of time and have disastrous consequences for entire regions. The effects on economic development alone are horrifying, creating maldevelopment and institutional deformation that further increases risk of renewed conflict if peace is not negotiated for. So the economic losses fade. However, in relation to the human costs are preposterous. We can continuously discuss the economic losses because we have the figures and it is easy to do quantitative analysis of these things. But the human loss and the human costs, the costs to the human life, it is just unbearable for most of these countries, and most of them have had challenges trying to recover. Mr. Mobile has advised, please add positivism and constructivism to the discourse. Yes, sir. We will definitely do that. All right. So, World War I shows us a huge increase in civilian deaths, made up 5% of the total casualties. But by World War II, the number rose to 50%. So 55% of the casualties of World War I were civilian deaths, and 50% in World War II. That is a huge increase. But the new millennium, as it has been known, has seen 80 to 90% of those killed in armed conflicts being civilians. And this is against the code of conduct of conflict. There are rules that govern warfare. There are rules that govern the conflicts that exist between states. And among those rules is that civilian casualties must be reduced to the most minimal. Okay, and it brings up the question, in a day and age when we have smart weapons and smart technology and we use different types of smart warfare, how is it that 80% at least of casualties of warfare and in any given situation are actually civilians? All right. So although actual number killed in conflicts has decreased since 1990, the trend shows now, more than ever, civilians have a stake in conflicts of their societies. So groups or individuals have everything to gain by engaging initiatives aimed at resolving conflicts and promoting social change without the use of violence. For those of you that are involved in peace-building activities and peace and conflict activities, you are on the right track and you're moving in the right direction to ensure that we have the resolution of conflict without violence, as well as the promotion of social change towards more peaceful efforts. So the existing institutions in the international system still primary arenas for dealing with interstate conflicts. The institutions that are already present are very relevant in themselves and very effective. However, the emergence of intrastate conflicts, just like we have said, has resulted in a new discourse and terminology, as well as new institutional policies and practices. So within this framework and in the midst of atrocities of war, it becomes imperative for us to disguise new ways of resisting, resolving, and transforming violent conflicts. And it is the duty of those specialized in these fields to continuously develop mechanisms and methods by which we can more effectively deal with issues of intrastate conflicts, conflicts between societies within the state. So these are invented by people living in conflict-ridden societies in the world most of the times, and because it's the impact of these conflicts in their societies that has created a demand for them to act. So you find there are more efforts towards understanding the impact of, for instance, DDR methods in countries that are recently were involved in conflict. So this is imperative, and it's only right and it's only normal, because countries that may not have been involved in conflict in the recent times do not maybe have a complete understanding of the impact of violent conflict in societies. So the evolution of war starts with the decline of interstate conflict after World War II. It is inspired by a period known as the Long Peace period that is categorized and usually typically used with the word Cold War. Okay, so this implies a certain movement towards global peace. All right, so there's an eruption of ethnic conflicts around the early 90s that brought a different kind of conflict that researchers simply overlooked. At the end of the World War II, there's a combination of factors that led to the obsolescence of interstate wars. So some of these factors included bipolarity. Okay, bipolarity played a huge role in the reducing of numbers. Okay, as well as the invention of nuclear weapons. Okay, the invention of nuclear weapons just simply changed the dynamic. When we witnessed the attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki as an indirect attack by the United States on the Soviet Union, because it happens at a period of time when Japan is literally retreating on all fronts. So why then does the US advance to attack Japan? It is to send a message to the Soviet Union. So we look at the invention of nuclear weapons just simply change the dynamic of conflict. From one gun, one bullet, one man, it changes everything. It can kill people over several square meters and kilometers, and impacts can exist for 10, 30, 40 years to go. So this changes the understanding of interstate conflict. So Mr. Mobila adds that damage control is critical in minimizing the effects of overt conflict on the civilian population. Yes, sir, extremely. And that is why we must be a step ahead, especially as experts in this field, because the impact it has shown that is more on civilian populations. Okay, so among the other issues that led to the decline is also the lowering of nationalism on a global scale. So nationalism is seen coming down, and countries are embracing a much more internationalist approach. There's very little nationalism type of thinking, and all these put together ended up undermining wars of conquest, because individuals did not completely relate so much with them being patriots of the state as much as they did with being international citizens, global citizens. So it becomes impactful, and we realize in that period that it impacts me as much as it does you, should both our countries be involved in violent conflict. Okay? So in a world where war was defined as interstate war, the trend was understood as movement towards global peace. And this is where the paradoxical long peace of the Cold War comes in. So for many years, academic research on war and conflict has centered on international relations. And it is in this field that you find the majority of experts on peace and conflict, international relations. Very few on the local spectrum. So states are seen as only actors capable of waging war. So the research is focused on understanding the decline of interstate conflict. Various theories formulated to explain this decline. And this is where I came in. If you're writing down, this is important. One of the, or rather two, that have actually come up as being extremely significant and impactful is one, the nuclear deterrence theory. The nuclear deterrence theory. Just jot it down, try and research on it because it's a complete class of its own. But in summary, the simple understanding that states could no longer proceed to engage in conflict with themselves because they were moving more towards nuclear conflict, and as such they had to agree that it's imperative for them to both reduce on their stockpiles of nuclear weapons. And this sees the likes of Gorbachev playing a very significant role in the Soviet Union, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the independence of the former Soviet states, and the birth of the Russian Federation around 1990. So the second theory that comes very significant is the democratic peace theory. Okay, democracies, and it is believed, according to this theory, that democracies are unlikely to wage wars against one another. Okay, it's simply, that's what it means. It means that, and it gives various reasons. For instance, the economic costs of war on a democracy is much higher. The fact that democracies have to consult from the parliaments, and parliaments must consult from the people, and who are most likely are not going to be in favor of conflict. So the democratic peace theory also comes as a very significant factor in determining interstate war and the decline, therefore, of interstate war. So below the surface were non-state actors who engaged in a type of warfare with many names, and some of these we've called them civil war, intrastate war, low-intensity conflict, guerrilla war, and wars of national liberation. They're examples of countries that have each, suffered from such type of conflicts, and these were seen as almost below the radar, because at the greater expanse of things, we were all looking at which country will fight which country next. Meanwhile, within the state, there were serious covert operations and activities going on that derailed socio-economic progression, and that were in fact valid categorizations as conflict. Okay, so this took time for the academic community as well as the international community to realize that civil war was one type of armed conflict that persisted post-World War II period, while we were still trying to recover and to keep track of ways in which we can prevent interstate conflict, which inevitably died a natural death, of course with serious interventions and efforts. We ignored that there was, in fact, a predominance of conflicts within our societies. And this existed for such a long time that it had enough impact to cause a great shift in the theoretical understanding of conflict in the modern day academia, as well as international relations practice, and as well as diplomatic practice. So this understanding was brought by a spectacular eruption of ethnic conflicts soon after the Cold War comes to an end. So soon after the Cold War comes to an end, the world shifts towards facing serious conflicts within states, and countries are put at a juncture where they have to now change their understanding of things. Their normally defensive approach against other states should now be brought into understanding home affairs and national security issues, which was less paid attention to over the years. So the Cold War sustained industry of think tanks, as well as projects that had allowed researchers to cling to the idea of war as an interstate conflict. It was convenient. Civil wars were always considered as a messy form of conflict. Nobody really looked at civil wars as being an area of academic interest. It's looked at as a messy form of conflict, and it's deprived armies of their gallant expressions and their show off. How does a government demonstrate nuclear warheads against its own people? It's impossible. When it is fighting another state, it can show off and host parades and do what with nuclear warheads and all that ammunition. But when it is its own people that are fighting against it, it becomes a bit more challenging. So the elements that most people associate with the very essence of war were brushed off. Okay, so it includes the shiny uniforms of the militaries, the mass armor, pitched battles and clear front lines. So it's very difficult. There's no clear front line, because look at the apartheid regime fighting the Umkhonto we Sizwe movement of the ANC, the military branch and military wing of the African National Congress, and an operation. A recent revelation came out that certain elements of the Umkhonto we Sizwe managed to organize, with the help of ZAPU and other institutions within Zimbabwe at the time, Zimbabwe, which had already become independent, managed to organize an attack on the nuclear weapon, on the nuclear plant based in the heart of South Africa. So you can see the regime at the time can plan to say, should an attack come from Kenneth Kaunda's Zambia, they should be able to resist. They should be able to find a way to meet, to organize a military response. But when the attack is on a plant like the nuclear plant, it becomes a much more challenging mode of conflict. Similarly, recently we were hit with shock prices in the oil industry following an attack by the Houthis on a Saudi Arabian Aram Oil, the Saudi Arabian oil company. Their main plant was hit, and it cut production by significant numbers. And it was hit through a clandestine operation that was done by a group that cannot be traced to any geographical location. So how do you fight a warfare like that? It's easy when the battlefront is set, when the conflict is between Egypt and Syria, and it's known where the battle is, or Israel and Egypt, and you know where the battlefront is. You are fighting at the Sinai over the basin, and it is known that when you push, military attack comes in and resistance and the like. But when there is no clear illustration of boundaries, how do you proceed? Okay, so civil war became difficult to ignore because of those factors, both for the damage it causes in the developing world and its potential to produce negative effects for the developed world. So transnational terrorists who use failed states as their base, and population displacement leading to mass migrations. There are various impacts of conflict. That is why the Middle East has continued to deteriorate, because it's not only the conflicts that exist in those countries that is being predominant, it is also conflicts that are held together by activities of belligerent groups that are not even members of that state. For instance, the Palestinians have been launching conflict and attacks on Israel and Israel's allies from several points within the Middle East, from Lebanon, from several other countries. And this is because of their own displacement. They've been displaced, and so they've had to fuse into other societies and then launch attacks from there. How does Israel as a country respond to an attack from an unknown source? So there are a lot of statistics around it. I'll not go too much into it, but in addition to direct fatalities, civil war causes many more indirect ones. For instance, mass displacement is one significant impact of civil war. Epidemics, both health and otherwise, famines are significantly probable to occur, and the degradation of public infrastructure. When you drive through a country such as the Central African Republic, it's something else. It's something else. There's a serious deterioration of public infrastructure because of the presence of conflict and the uncertainty that comes with it. And so people are least likely to set up any permanent institutions because it can go down at any time. So you're always on the move and on the brink of movement. So economic development therefore stalls, and it even becomes reversed because investors are less likely to invest in a situation that is fragile. And recently a public discussion was held trying to assess the location of the Dangote group of companies, the cement department in Zambia, in Dola. I think it's Mushili area, and many theorists and economic analysts said or posited that the target market was in fact the Congo, but because of the fragility of the situation in Congo, it becomes less economically wise to set up a plant in Congo. So why not set it up in Zambia, which has almost guaranteed peace, and from which you enjoy the benefits of serious tax regimes and things like that, and then export to the Congo. Those were assumptions that were brought about by economic theorists. But it's always beneficial to invest in an industry and in a country that is much more at peace. Also, economic development has stalled. There's what is known as the conflict trap. Okay? And this is why the conflict trap is the reason why most countries have remained backward. It is believed that once you go the conflict way, the violent conflict way, it's impossible to come back. And that's why there's great cause, and that's why there's significant efforts to try and deter countries like Zambia, which have not had significant violent conflict, to deter them from going that path, because it's a route of no return, honestly speaking. And there's evidence to show that once society engulfs itself in violent conflict once, it is almost impossible to turn back from that. Violence then becomes the natural go-to method of conflict resolution. The moment a society goes that direction, there are very few societies that have survived that. A case study was Burundi. Burundi gets enveloped in a crisis and civil war, and that leads to serious deaths. And the international community comes in and they test peace-building mechanisms, and peace building is put to the test in Burundi, and it works. The international community goes in applause, and Burundi is put up as an emblem and a sign of how peace building is actually effective. And with time, a simple contestation to power, leading to President Pierre Nkurunziza's demand for an extra term in office, simply spirals Burundi back into conflict and reverses all the progress that has been made. Now you can imagine the investment that has been made in Burundi by the United Nations, especially trying to project Burundi as a country in which efforts to peace have worked successfully. And then all of a sudden it messes up, and conflict and it goes south, So this comes in as an example of the impact of the conflict trap. People died in Burundi. I think that was around 2016, 2017, and it was a case. It changed from being a case study of progress and the impact of peace building efforts to being a shame, in the international community. And the United Nations looks at Burundi and says, "Well, we tried our best. How can a country go back to conflict?" It's simple, because the conflict trap is a reality. Once you go the violent way, there's no turning back. Eventually, you can make significant progress, but eventually the society becomes attuned to using violence as a method of conflict resolution. Therefore, for societies that have not yet embraced, or that have not yet gone the violent way of conflict resolution, it's imperative that you don't. It's imperative that we make efforts towards ensuring that peace and sustainability and positive peace become implemented in our societies. So the resurgence of ethnic conflict, this is early post-Cold War, led students to ethnic studies, these are sociologists as well as political scientists, to turn to civil wars. Okay? The number of state-based armed conflicts in the world declined from 53 to 2016 to 49 in 2017. Of course, the Islamic State was active in 31% of all these conflicts. So the Islamic State has also played a very significant role in the conceptualization of global conflict and our understanding of peace studies, because the impact that they have had in international relations, warfare, peace studies has been significant. You can imagine that 31% of the conflicts was alluded to them as at 2017. So the number of non-state conflicts increased from 62 in 2016 to 82 in 2017. That is 20 new conflicts and warfares. So there was a significant decline in conflict casualties, however, but internationalized conflicts and non-state conflicts continued to represent major threats. Those of you who are interested, Google up the term internationalized conflicts. Interstate and intrastate conflict. So interstate warfare. Now I'm going to cruise from here up to the end of this class. I think I've laid the foundation. And so this coming 10-15 minutes will be a simple browse through of whatever we are hoping to grasp. So interstate war. This is interstate conflict occurs between two governments employing their respective two armed forces. The conflict can occur anywhere and often began with a formal declaration. You declare. You don't just go into interstate conflict or into war. It's a declaration. You say, and Congress or Parliament or whatever the House of Assembly is called in that country, you come up with a declaration to say, we are now going to conflict with country B, and the reasons are this and this and that and that. And often this comes after serious failed efforts towards peace. Okay? So we have looked at the reasons why interstate wars have declined, and Mark in 2007 posits, for instance, things like ending of the colonial politics, the end of the Cold War, not the lack of proxy wars, the increased level of international activism spearheaded by the United Nations. Preventive diplomacy has shown to play a very positive impact in declining interstate conflict. Peacekeeping as well as peacemaking missions. Friends of the Secretary General, these are arms and individuals who have significant influence in certain regions and as such are able to promote peace. Individuals like Thabo Mbeki have been known to shine. Individuals like Obasanjo for Africa have been known to come through. I know Kenneth Kaunda sits on the African Union, Elders Council, and things like that. These are friends of the Secretary General. These are people who have a track record of advocating for peace. So the increased popularity of global legal norms that denounce the use of military force. Most people would rather associate themselves with that. So intrastate conflict, on the other hand, is the most common type of conflict and occurs between armed forces of the government and an opposing civil organized group within the state borders. Okay, so these conflicts are often driven by ethnic, religious, or ideological or incompatible positions. In order to understand the drive behind intrastate conflict, I recommend that we read The Clash of Civilization by Samuel P. Huntington. I have a copy of it for those of you who have not yet gotten your hands on The Clash of Civilizations. please, you can just type it in my inbox or something, and I'll send it to you so that you can read through this. It was a great projection of what the future would be, and it was spot on, and that is what it has been. We have conflicts significantly and predominantly because of ideological differences and not political affiliations, for instance. Okay, and in fact, even those that are because of political affiliations have ideological and as well as ethnic attachments to them. Kenya, for instance, where you have two political parties seemingly differing over electoral votes and electoral dominance, but when you investigate further and deeper, you realize that there is actually ethnic divide, there is tribal affiliations, and there is regional divides involved in the conflict. So it's beyond just politics. There's also ethnicity, religion, and things of that sort. So there is a difference between the classical intrastate conflict without foreign intervention and intrastate conflict with a foreign involvement, which involved at least one party engaged in the conflict supported by military troops of a foreign government. The Congo, okay, Congo with the senior Kabila, not the last Kabila, his father, gives a perfect example to this. Here you have a conflict. Kabila comes into power, faces resistance from apparently predominantly foreign troops, but resistance from within the country, and they are marching on to Kinshasa. And when Kabila realizes that his troops are being run down and overrun because they just survived, themselves just came into power, and there's need to regroup and to formalize because this was a rebel group. So the moment they come into power, there's significant resistance facing them. As these troops are marching towards Kinshasa, Kabila enlists the help of foreign countries. I'm aware Zimbabwe, I think Malawi, Namibia, I think even South Africa are seen to volunteer troops to try and mitigate the conflict. Of course, it is believed that it was in exchange for mines in the Congo. These have not been formalized, most of these discussions, but that is what it is. And just recently, we are faced in Southern Africa 2 days ago with attacks from a group that has, in English, been termed the young people or the youths, but framed as Al-Shabaab, active in Mozambique. And it's believed that even there, troops from, I think, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and other countries under the blanket of SADC have mobilized to try and resist that movement of the Islamic radicalism. And these are examples, okay? So the two spectrums, if when you look at intrastate conflict, it can be between within the state but with the support of an international element, or within the state and without the support of an international element. So some of the causes are, we've already alluded to them. Economists stress the impact of natural resources. International relations experts point to ethnic antagonism. Comparativists as well as sociologists have focused on the role of the state. Okay, the role of the state. So when you look at it from an economic point of view, civil war can be caused by natural resources, availability or scarcity. When it's availability, it's an issue of distribution. When it's scarcity, it's an issue of access. When it's international relations scholars, on the other hand, have said ethnic antagonism can much more be alluded to as a reason for conflict or civil war. Comparativists as well as sociologists have focused on the role of the state. This is the inability of the state to reach out, to a greater length. I will not get into it, but for those of you that want to understand the economic source of civil wars, I refer you to Paul Collier. Paul Collier from the University of Oxford has written largely about this. I will not get into it. Okay, but among his assumptions includes one that is predominant, which is the fact that civil wars are in fact a criminal enterprise rather than a political or social phenomenon. So he's an economist. He says that civil wars, they are not a social phenomenon or a political phenomenon. They're just a way to get a buck, to get a quick buck, to get an access to resources. And he gives the example of Sierra Leone and DRC, where diamonds and other resources are there. That is why people are involved in conflict, because they're trying to have access to resources and make some money. He's an economist. International relations experts, I refer you to Donald Horowitz. He's from the Duke University. He writes significantly, especially about the theory of ethnic animosities. Okay, this theory is based on social psychology of group identity, and he gives the example of Bosnia. So, for those of you who would like to understand it from international relations perspective, Donald Horowitz is your guy. He'll get into a depth understanding of ethnicity and ethnic fragmentation and how it has impacted our understanding of the state. Where else can we go? Okay, so I'm just read through Mr. Mwebela. So he says, besides socio-economic effects of war, I would want to add to the debate by bringing into perspective the psychological effects. Yes, all whether neighbors, his countries and individuals alike begin to view each other with suspicion, mistrust. This is perpetrators versus victims. Hence they relapse into violence even on minor issues, thus the trap. Yes, so even the psychological impact, you're very right, sir. It equally, keeps us delved into the trap. That's why the conflict trap is a serious mess, because it does not only present us as a state involved in conflict with a challenge, it also creates problems for our neighbors, and our neighbors begin to see us differently. And for instance, East Africa is a very fragile region, very fragile, because of the activities in Burundi, the activities in Rwanda, the activities in the Congo, Tanzania, as well as Uganda. Now, Angola also has come in, and you must. It's become a boiling pot, because it is believed that the conflict that is going on in the Congo, for instance, is in fact propagated by Rwandese forces, who are facing resistance from the Rwandese government, which is facing resistance from the Ugandan government, and as such, these Congolese who are displaced from the Congo because of the activities of the Rwandese find themselves in Angola. The Angolans also repress these Congolese back to the Congo, and Tanzania must provide a certain perspective of leadership. Uganda must answer the call. So you can imagine such a chain. Neighbors, and it's a chain. It's something that you can't break out of, especially because African countries are in essence one society. Tribal groups exist in all these societies. You have Lingala speaking people in almost all these countries we've mentioned. You have Tutsis and Hutus in almost all these countries you've mentioned. You have Swahilis in almost all these countries. How do you separate and distinct them? So you're very right, sir. And also on the end of the Cold War is put up as one of the causes of civil wars. We will not go into that. But extra-state conflict occurs between a state member of the international system and a political entity. Not a system member, no. But a political entity outside of its exterior boundaries. Okay? So these are extra-state. This is state versus independent non-state actor. The consequences are significant. We know them already. Countries suffer from many different consequences, which includes, of course, the death of people. And it's very difficult most times to estimate the numbers. Civilians and soldiers are killed in combat. There's death from starvation and hunger, the prevalence of diseases, violent crime, mass migration. They also face the high risk of renewed conflict, just like we've said on the conflict trap. There's just that high risk of renewed conflict, because all you have is negative peace. And of course, unemployment. When it comes to economic consequences, there are myriad of them. So it's a humanitarian imperative, and the social consequences: mortality levels are increased, battle deaths are high. Battle deaths These are distinguished between battle deaths, okay? So battle deaths are combatants and civilians killed during military operations. And total war deaths include battle deaths plus deaths from disease, starvation, malnutrition, and crime. And it's difficult to estimate the second one, total war deaths, because of displacement and because of... So you'd never know who is displaced and who died and who is, it's very difficult to recover. It takes years to have the social understanding, okay? However, men aged 15 to 29 are most likely to die during a conflict. That is standard. But women make up nearly a quarter of all battle deaths. So you can understand that it is irrespective of gender conflicts, okay? The legacy is also terrible, and this is one issue that comes in with the psychological impact of it. That it's no longer just an issue. The conflict may end, but the legacy that it leaves, it's lasting. It's lasting, and it takes years and years before you can recover, because no matter where you go, no matter what you do, there's a certain perception that even others have of you, and even yourselves have of yourselves. No matter what Rwanda does, it has made so much progress, but up to date, Rwanda has been unable to shake away the psychological attachment of its genocide. Okay, so yeah, regional spillover through displacements, internally displaced persons, and things like that. These are your neighbors will be affected. So children, girls, and women, violent conflicts affect these groups. Child soldiers, for instance, are an example of a way in which they are affected. Renamo used, which is believed from Homvana 2006, reveals that Renamo used a minimum of 10,000 child soldiers between the age 6 to 7. Angola also has a considerable proportion of children participated in combat, and 7% of all Angolan children had fired at someone. 7%. That is something we must consider. So rituals come into play, traditional healers come into play. The economic legacy of conflict, we've already discussed this. As such, among the economic legacy, prolonged civil war, economic decline, infrastructure comes out, military spending is almost tripled, doubled in some cases, capital flight, investors leave, structural changes, professions and civil society, civil service, law, accountancy, and medicine are all sectors that are affected seriously. In conclusion, violent conflicts last longer and are deadlier in Africa than in other regions. The result is that social and economic costs of conflict are higher in Africa. So the costs spread well beyond borders of host country to conflict, okay? And the costs also endure long after military operations end. For instance, it becomes almost impossible to undo the military expenditure, because you enlist several thousands of soldiers, and it's just almost impossible to just throw them back into society. You must continue to sustain them. You must continue to operate huge militaries at the expense of socio-economic progress. So violent conflict kills long after the fighting stops, as well as the health sectors. Post-conflict economies are devastated and unable to meet huge demand for health services. Also, the economic costs of a conflict are also high, although these are difficult to estimate, just like we said earlier. And understanding and dealing with costs of conflict is a major challenge to recovery from conflict. Okay, so Muzaffar Elkan Yilmaz writes, he says, the main threat to peace does not come from major interstate confrontations anymore, but from intrastate conflicts that occur within the borders of states. This is according to Muzaffar Elkan Yilmaz. Alright, so in essence, today's class has been about conflict and trying to understand interstate and intrastate. It is now possible for us to pick this up by trying to have an understanding now within the state, the conflicts that exist and the contestations for power. So now we can discuss issues such as elections. Now we can discuss issues such as violence now within the state, okay? And also now we can go and discuss issues surrounding conflict outside of the state or within countries and concepts such as hegemony and concepts such as excuse me, concepts that relate to international relations, okay, and how states exists in their individual capacity as entities of their own, okay. So from now, that's the direction we're going. So we have given a foundation of interstate and intrastate relations, and now we're going to delve deeper in classes to follow on these issues and how they impact on our society. So if you have any questions further than this, please feel free to hit my inbox. We will continue to I review all the comments that are given, and we try to answer them to the best of our abilities in the next class for those that are not very satisfied with the answers. And also, I have materials on these discussions that we're having. So if you are interested in certain significant materials, for instance, it's imperative for you to read Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, for instance. I have that book and I can share it. It's an article, I can share it with you. You can just hit me up in my inbox and I'll give that to you. As well as any other materials that exist. There are several writings about the economic impact, and I'll be able to share that with you. So if you do have questions or you'd like to read more on these things, I have materials on democratic peace theory and on the nuclear theories, and if you are interested, hit my inbox and I'll send that material to you so that in your own time you can go through them. Alright, so thank you so much for today's class. Those of you that came through, those of you that will read or that will go through this after it will be posted on my page, feel free to go through that. Okay, that, ladies and gentlemen, is interstate and intrastate war. Please remember to wash your hands, to observe social distancing, to stay at home if you can, and wear your mask, okay, so that we bring an end to the coronavirus. Thank you so much, and God bless you.